A billionaire CEO spots a little boy reading his autobiography in a bookstore. Enjoying the moment, he asks if he can sign it for him. So, there's this chapter that's missing, right? And then the kid just drops this huge bombshell that totally makes the knees buckle. You totally forgot about that. The part where you left your son before we start. Just let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And if you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up to support the channel. Now, just sit back, relax, and enjoy. The bookstore felt a bit quieter than normal, with the gentle sound of pages turning mixing in the air, with the occasional murmur of conversation. Michael Steele wasn't really the type to hang around places like this, but he mentioned at the press conference that he was just stopping by as a favor to a publishing executive. His autobiography was selling really well, which was no surprise considering his status. The store had set up a sleek display nearby. Having a few signed copies at the entrance could really help boost sales even more. He was flipping through them. He came across a new release that he hadn't really planned on reading. But then he noticed a boy sitting cross-legged on the carpet by his display had this kid, probably around 9 or 10, wearing a t-shirt that looked like it was a bit too big. And the shorts had definitely seen better days. The book in his hands, his book, looked oversized compared to his small frame. He flipped through the pages with intense focus, the cover slightly bent. Michael wasn't quite sure why he had stopped. It could have been the unusual sight of such a young kid reading an autobiography, or maybe it was just a moment that sparked some curiosity. Breaking through his usual detachment, he casually strolled over and, without any introduction, pulled a pen from his pocket and he quickly scribbled his name on the title page and enjoyed the story. The boy barely glanced. His eyes darted to the signature, and his lips pressed together in what almost resembled amusement. He tilted his head, noticing that a chapter was missing. Michael smirked, anticipating something. Just a little smart comment about business strategies, or maybe a critique on how he climbed to the top. And hey, what's the deal with the kid? He closed the book with a soft thud and looked him in the eye without flinching. It was the part where you left your son behind. Everything. It felt like everything around him just paused, the soft murmur of voices, the faint beeping from the checkout counter, and the heaviness of the book in his hands. Still open in his hand. Everything faded into static. He felt the words more than he processed them, like a punch to the. He delivered it with perfect precision. But his mind was scrambling to find the context for some reason. The kid was just staring at him, looking way too calm for something so ridiculous. His voice. He came out slower than he meant to. What did you just say? The boy totally unfazed pushed himself up to his feet, tucking the book under his arm. Thanks. He gave a casual nod for the autograph. As if he hadn't just caused a seismic shift through the foundation of Michael's world and then just turned away. Michael was still standing there, frozen in place. When his assistant Jonas appeared beside him. Everything okay? He took a moment to clear his head, and then the logical side of him started to kick in, listing all the reasons why what happened. It just happened, and it didn't make any sense. He pushed himself to move, sliding the pen back into his pocket as if nothing had happened. Happened fine, he muttered. Just a strange interaction. Jonas raised an eyebrow, but he didn't push the man. He had worked for him long enough to know when to let things slide. Michael, on the other hand, wasn't so sure he'd be able to do the same. He just couldn't let this go. His mind was racing through all the possibilities, but no matter how he looked at it, I tried everything, but the answer was still the same. It just wasn't possible. It couldn't be possible, and he could sense a shift deep in his gut, something that made him realize this wasn't just a prank or a. As he left the bookstore, the boy's words kept bouncing around in his head, each time making that knot in his stomach feel a little tighter. In his stomach, the part where you left your son Michael spent the rest of the evening in a haze, replaying. He kept replaying the bookstore encounter in his mind, having initially brushed past it. He was pretty sure the boy was either mistaken or just trying to get a rise out of him, but the confidence in his voice, the way he nodded at him without hesitation, felt a bit off somehow. By the time he got home, he was really in the zone with his usual evening routine, checking emails and skimming through them. As he poured himself a drink and settled into his quiet penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that reviewing market trends was just pointless. He looked out over the city skyline, his mind wandering through the past, trying to find a thread that could make sense of it all. He was always careful. He never acted recklessly in his personal life and had his share of relationships. Sure, but nothing too serious. Nothing that really lasted even back in his younger days. When work took over and connections felt temporary, he was never the kind to just disappear without a word, tying up loose ends. But then something stirred in the back of his mind, a trip. Nearly a decade ago in Barcelona, there was a woman named Isabel who sat up straighter. It felt like the name was finally finding its spot. Like that one puzzle piece you thought was lost. It wasn't anything too serious, just a short fling while he was around. While overseas on business, they spent a few nights together, enjoying a connection that felt effortless. He left pretty quickly, not really expecting anything else from it. She didn't reach out, and neither did he. But it seemed like the timing was perfect. If she had been pregnant and hadn't mentioned it, he was already pulling out his phone. When I called Jonas, his assistant picked up on the second ring. I need you to find out. I want to know everything about a kid named CEO Michael. I met him at the bookstore. So today, he says I'm his dad. And there was this moment of silence before Jonas finally replied, I'll take care of it. Michael didn't feel the need to explain, and Jonas was smart enough to understand that. He questioned him, then hung up and put his phone down, but that uneasy feeling in his chest just wouldn't go away. Meanwhile, across the city, Leo was. As Isabel slipped into the hotel room, she noticed her mother and Daniel waiting. She turned away from where she was folding. She looked at him, narrowing her eyes. Where have you been? Leo just shrugged, kicking at the ground. Daniel looked up from his phone while walking around, his sneakers off. You know, I wasn't wandering off alone. There were tons of people around. Isabel let out a sharp breath, rubbing her forehead. Leo, you can't just vanish like that. Imagine a city you're unfamiliar with. What if something unexpected occurred? But in reality, nothing happened. She just studied him for a long moment, then crossed her arms. Why do I feel like you're not telling me something? Leo flopped onto the bed was dodging her gaze, and Daniel chuckled. Trying to figure it all out because you don't trust me. Feeling the tension, the kids had a point. Isabel shot him a look, but Leo jumped in. He quickly buried himself under the covers to avoid any more questions from her. He definitely wasn't planning on sharing anything else. He hadn't told her what he had done yet because he knew she'd just get mad, and it could get even worse. Jonas called back just after midnight, and Michael had been expecting it. He was trying to stop him from seeing Michael again. So, he called, and when he picked up, the info hit him even harder than he expected. They're tourists, Jonas said. They'll be here for a few weeks, staying at the Fairmont. Michael pinched the bridge of his nose, already feeling the weight of it all. So, about the next question, who's the mother? Isabel Ramirez. A Spanish citizen, works as. You two met a translator during a business trip years ago, right, Jonas? She paused for a moment before going on. She's here with her fiancé, Daniel Navarro. And as far as, it seems like he really thinks Leo is his son. Michael just sat back, holding the phone tightly. Hey, tighter. It looks like there's no record of Isabel ever trying to reach out to you, right? There were no lawsuits, no letters, nothing. Jonas hesitated. I don't think she ever mentioned it. The words landed heavy in Michael's stomach. He had spent his life building an empire and making decisions that shaped industries, but at that moment, he felt totally unprepared. Panic wasn't really his style. He had always been the kind of guy who stayed calm. They had navigated negotiations worth billions, experiencing both losses and wins with the same steady composure. But this was different. It wasn't just business. This was a kid who had walked up to him today with a kind of certainty that felt like it couldn't just be fate. His fingers. He drummed his fingers against the table, his mind racing through different scenarios. There was only one way to know for sure, he said. Jonas sighed. I figured you would. I'll take care of it quietly. I really don't want any attention on this. Michael ended the call and looked at his reflection in the darkened window. He never planned to be a father. But if the test confirmed what he suspected, he had already suspected it. Everything in his life, his priorities, and his carefully constructed world was about to change. He couldn't have predicted the ways things would unfold. Michael didn't get much sleep that night. His mind was racing. It's like a relentless machine, just going over the details again and again. Running through different scenarios and calculating probabilities, but not this. It wasn't just a business deal, and honestly, no amount of analysis could have gotten him ready for what was about to happen. The DNA test was already underway, but he wasn't the type to just sit back and wait. He needed answers. And he needed them right away. The next morning, Jonas. I let him know that Isabel and Daniel had left the hotel with Leo, but they ended up splitting up. Daniel took Leo's. Isabel was at a cafe not far from the hotel, enjoying some sightseeing all by herself. It's the perfect chance. No distractions, no interruptions, just the straight-up truth. Michael got to the cafe without a solid plan. He was just there to confront her, and then he saw her. She was sitting right by the window, coffee in hand, scrolling through her phone. It was like looking at a mirror image of him. I remembered her long, dark hair and sharp features, and that same quiet intensity when I saw her. After all these years, it sent a strange ripple through him, but he brushed it off. This wasn't about nostalgia. She walked right over to her table and grabbed the seat across from her before Isabel even had a moment to react. Isabel's eyes. She flicked it up, and for a moment, she just stared. Then, slowly, she said, "My phone." "Down, Michael." Her voice was steady, but he noticed how her fingers tightened. She was caught off guard by the cup. "Can you explain to me why a kid just—" "He came up to me yesterday and said I abandoned him." He kept his tone steady, but the weight of it was just too much to overlook. Isabel let out a breath through her nose and looked over at the window, as if she was gathering her thoughts when she glanced back at him, her expression hard to read. "So, you met Leo?" "Yeah. I met Leo too." His jaw tightened, and I just don't get why. "I'm meeting him like this." She took a slow sip of coffee, and for a moment, she seemed like she wasn't going to answer at first. But then she carefully set the cup down and looked him straight in the eye. I didn't really see the point in mentioning it. Michael's grip tightened around the edge of the table. "And you didn't notice?" Her expression didn't change at all. "We had a fling, Michael. It wasn't anything serious. I didn't think you'd ever look back after you left. I had no reason to believe otherwise. I figured you'd want to be involved, but I wasn't going to beg you to be a father to a child you didn't even know about." He leaned forward a bit, his voice dropping. "That wasn't your decision to make," she said, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Let's be real. Your life is like, well, you're Michael Steele, right? So, when it comes to your company and the image you project, do you really believe you'd just let everything go? I mean, think about it. If I had just called you out of the blue 9 years ago, playing the role of dad, the worst part would have been, she was right. The guy he used to be wouldn't have even considered the idea. He had been totally wrapped up in work, in success, in the never-ending chase for more, but realizing that she had made that choice for him, that she had completely written him off, stirred something sharp inside. "You didn't even give me a chance," he said, looking at his chest. Isabel's jaw tightened. "No, I didn't," she said, and they sat there in intense silence, neither of them speaking. He was ready to break first. But just before he could push further, the bell above the door jingled, and a familiar voice rang out. "Hey, it's you." Michael turned just in time to see Leo bounding toward them. He stopped at the table, grinning like they were old friends, and looked between them, completely unaware of the tension in the air. "Thickening the air? I didn't know you guys knew each other," Leo said to Michael. I looked over at Isabel, who was trying to smooth out her expression, but the tiredness in her eyes was still there. "We go way back," she said with a casual smile as Leo plopped down into the chair next to her. "He seems really pleased with himself, huh? That's cool. I was planning to find." "Hey, it's you again." "So?" He turned to Michael and said, "You left too fast yesterday." I had more to say. Michael was a bit taken aback by the sudden change in tone. Just a minute ago, he had been all set to confront Isabel, and now here was Leo, looking at him with that mix of curiosity and excitement, as if this was some big event. It was just another casual meeting. Isabel shot Michael a warning look, silently telling him to tread carefully. He cleared his throat. "What kind of questions?" Leo asked as he pulled out the copy of his. He pulled out his autobiography from his bag and placed it on the table. "Honestly, this book's a bit dull. You should totally add more cool stuff. Like a chapter on what you do when you're not working." Michael let out a quiet laugh. Even though he didn't want to admit it, "I'm always busy with work." Leo frowned, as if that was the worst response he could hear. "Oh no, that sounds awful. So, what do you like to do for fun?" It seemed like Isabel was really interested. She was about to step in. But Michael got there first. "I don't have time for fun," Leo said, squinting. She looked at him, trying to figure out if he was joking. Then he shook his head. Isabel couldn't help but let out a snort before she could catch herself. Michael shot her a sharp look, but he just shrugged. For once, he wasn't wrong. Michael was at a loss for words. This was definitely not how he had pictured things turning out. He had imagined it all going differently. There was tension, arguments, maybe even some anger, but Leo was just sitting there, totally relaxed. He was flipping through the pages of a book about his life, critiquing it as if he were an editor, but honestly, he just wasn't ready for it. He pushed back from the table, and his chair scraped against the floor. Isabel's amusement faded right away, replaced by a sense of quiet apprehension. "I have to go," Michael said, keeping his voice steady. He wasn't quite sure what else he wanted to add. It seemed like I could say it in front of Leo. He didn't look disappointed, but there was a certain understanding in his expression, like he knew something. He figured this would be the reaction. "Okay," Leo said, easily slipping the book back into his hands. "Catch you later." It was said with a confidence that really suggested there was no doubt about it. Michael paused for just a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the cafe. His thoughts were all over the place. This definitely wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Michael told himself he was done thinking about it. He had walked out of that cafe was chosen to create some distance and maintain control. It was meant to be just a one-time meeting, an unexpected one at that. A disruption in his well-organized life that he thought he could ignore, but ignoring it ended up being. It felt impossible. His thoughts just kept circling back. No matter how much work he threw himself into, he could still hear Leo's voice. "Did you notice how the kid grinned at him?" It was like they shared this unspoken understanding. "See you around." It felt like, just like that. By the third day, it was pretty obvious that ignoring the situation just wasn't going to work. He had always been a man of action, someone who tackled problems head-on. Yet, here he was, hesitating. There's no blueprint for this, no strategy to lean on. The uncertainty really got to him. Feeling a bit restless, he ended up taking an unexpected detour to the art museum after his business meeting. It was a distraction he hadn't anticipated. Seeing Leo there caught him off guard. At first, he didn't even. He suddenly realized what had caught his eye. As he strolled by a small exhibit, he spotted a bunch of tourists huddled together. A boy was standing in the middle of them, gesturing animatedly at a large canvas on the wall. His voice was just loud enough to grab Michael's attention, and when he turned to see who it was, he found himself face to face with the last person he expected. He imagined Leo standing there, hands on his hips, explaining the painting as if he had actually talked to the artist. "You see, this guy didn't just paint people. He told stories in such a way that you can't help but notice how he used the light. It's like he's guiding us on where to focus, ensuring we see exactly what he wants us to see. He wants us to notice the tourists, murmuring appreciatively and nodding along just like he was. There was this child prodigy, and one of them even snapped a photo of the plaque next to the painting, like she had just figured it all out." Michael stood there, a mix of amusement and genuine admiration washing over him. He couldn't help but be impressed by the kid, despite his own reservations. Leo must have felt the presence and confidence in the air because, mid-sentence, he turned and spotted something. Michael lit up like this was the most normal thing in the world. "Wow, he really did," said, dragging the word out with a teasing glint in his eye. "You again? You following me?" Michael folded his arms, and Leo nodded in agreement. "Not really convinced, huh? Just seems like a coincidence that you're..." So, the tourists, totally unaware of the exchange, had already moved on. But Leo didn't seem to mind. "Do you mind if I shift my attention fully to Michael? Do you like art?" Leo's face was twisted in mock horror, and honestly, that's just tragic. "I really doubt it, though." The kid let out a big sigh and shook his head, saying, "You have the personality of a corporate." Wow, Michael, that's quite the bold statement, especially coming from someone who was just sharing an unsolicited lecture on classical art that was actually wanted. They were interested. They were just playing along with you, Leo. It's pretty much the same deal. Michael really should have just walked away. He knew it made sense, but somehow he couldn't help being swept along as Leo began to weave through At the museum, they were chatting as if they had planned to meet up. He bounced from one topic to another, asking about Michael's business and why things were the way they were. Billionaires always seem to wear those same old boring suits, right? I mean, is running a company really as stressful as it looks, Michael? Answered some questions, dodged a few, but mostly just listened. The kid had his way of talking was so engaging that you just couldn't tune him out. He was sharp and quick-witted. Michael wasn't afraid to question things that didn't make sense to him, and honestly, most people around him weren't used to that either. He either agreed with everything Leo said or was careful not to push back, feeling too intimidated. But Leo didn't hold back. They found themselves standing in front of a modern sculpture. Something abstract and metallic that looked like. It seemed like it was thrown together at the last minute. Leo tilted his head, considering how it looked. Like a giant pretzel, Michael smirked. I was thinking paperclip. Leo snapped his fingers. That's it. Maybe a pretzel paperclip hybrid? We should totally suggest a new idea. Hey, go ahead. I'm sure the artist would really appreciate your feedback, Leo. She turned toward him with a thoughtful look. You're different than I expected. Michael raised an eyebrow. You had. So. Expectations, huh? Yeah, I checked out your book. Leo kind of waved his hand around, saying he thought you'd be. You know, it's like being serious and boring. Kind of like a statue that just talks about stocks, right, Michael? Let out a little laugh, and Leo tapped his chin like he was deep in thought. High praise. Leo nodded with a serious, yet slightly less boring vibe. Welcome. They strolled around the museum for a bit longer, chatting about various things, especially Michael. He wasn't really used to talking about what he did when he wasn't working. There wasn't much to say, and he often wondered if he ever got tired of being the boss. Sometimes, when asked about his hobbies, he found it tough to come up with an answer. It was a bit of a challenge for him. It was an oddly comfortable back and forth. Something he never expected to have with a kid. Eventually, Leo checked his watch and, ugh, I guess I should get going. My mom's going to lose it if I go missing again. Michael glanced at him. You make a habit of that? Not a habit, Leo said, drawing it out. Sometimes, Michael just shook his head. You're pretty lucky she hasn't put you on a leash. Leo grinned, saying she's definitely thought about it. They got to the entrance of the museum, and for the first time, an awkward pause hung in the air. Leo shifted on his feet. He stretched out his feet and then threw his hand out dramatically. Well, it's been real, old man. Michael paused for just a moment before accepting the handshake. Stop calling me that, he said. No promises. Leo responded with a grin. With a wave goodbye, he headed down the steps, blending into the bustling street. Michael kept watching until he was completely out of sight. Sighing, he rubbed his temple. He had just spent the afternoon wandering around a museum with a kid who, according to logic, didn't really fit into his life, but somehow, the conversation flowed more easily. It had been more enjoyable than he expected, and that realization kind of threw him off. Isabel immediately sensed something was off when she got back to the hotel. Even though Leo seemed to be in a good mood, it was almost too good, and there was this certain energy about him that just wasn't there before. He didn't really offer any explanation, though. He just hummed to himself while scrolling through his phone, and she took a seat across from him. She studied him for a moment before speaking. Leo, she said, but he didn't look up. Yeah. Hey. Where were you today? I heard you were out sightseeing with Daniel. Leo seemed to hesitate for just a moment there. Isabel frowned for a long time, while Leo just kept clicking his tongue. She narrowed her eyes, still not looking at her, just glancing around. He was definitely hiding. She could sense it, and deep down, she had a nagging feeling that she already knew. Leo wasn't exactly being discreet, and Isabel was well aware of it. She had picked up on the shift in. He was always a curious kid, but lately his curiosity had turned into something more focused. Almost like a business venture in finance, billionaire style. He started checking out news segments he never really paid attention to before, just scrolling through articles on his phone. She made a few little comments about investments and leadership. At first, she thought it was just one of his phases. He would get really into something for a few weeks, then switch to something new. But then there was that museum trip. The way he returned all energized, dodging her eyes when she inquired about his whereabouts, made her certain now. Daniel noticed it too, but in a different way. He had been with him. He wasn't focused on the little changes in Leo's behavior. He was more interested in the bigger picture and how Leo carried himself. Michael Steele's autobiography felt like a personal artifact, especially as he revisited those old interviews of the man. His expression was unreadable, but he absorbed every word. And I could see his eyes flicker with interest. It felt like something was off when Daniel or Isabel talked, like he was seeing them in a whole new light. At first, Daniel just brushed it off. Leo had always been a bright kid, always asking questions and always trying to learn more. Daniel was trying to make sense of the world around him, but as the days went by, that uneasy feeling in his chest just kept getting stronger. He began to pay more attention. He noticed how Isabel was connecting dots that he didn't want to connect. She seemed more tense than usual, keeping her eyes on Leo like she was waiting for something to go wrong. And then finally, late at night in their hotel room, Daniel finally couldn't keep it to himself any longer. Is Leo mine? The words lingered in the air, feeling heavier than anything he had ever said. Isabel froze, her back turned to him. Her hands tense, gripping the edge of the bathroom sink. She didn't turn around. Isabel, her voice was softer now, but the urgency was still there. She closed her eyes and took a slow breath, and turned to face him. There were so many different ways she could have answered. She could have softened the truth, managed to soften the impact, but as I look at Daniel now, at the man who had, he raised Leo like he was his own, never once doubting that love until now. She just couldn't bring herself to. She didn't need to say a word. The pause in her silence spoke volumes. Daniel stepped back as if he'd been struck, his mouth hanging open. He closed his hands into fists for a moment, then relaxed them again, letting out a sharp exhale. He shook his head, almost like he was trying to wake himself up. Since when? At first, her voice was just a whisper, and he let out a hollow laugh while running a hand through his hair, down his face. And you never thought to mention it? I really thought I was doing the right thing by protecting him, she said, though the words felt a bit weak even to her own ears. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then scoffed. He shook his head again, not saying a word, then grabbed his jacket and walked out. Isabel didn't make any effort to stop him. The next morning, Leo could tell right away that something was off. Daniel was unusually quiet. He was distant, barely meeting his eyes. It wasn't that he was mad exactly. There was no yelling, no harsh words or lectures, but that just made things worse. Daniel had never been there. They sat at breakfast, almost in silence, with the usual playful energy missing. Something heavy and unfamiliar had taken the place of what used to be there. Leo poked at his food, feeling the unease grow in his stomach. He set his coffee down and rubbed his temples, clearly at his wit's end. Did I do something wrong? A hand covered his face before he finally looked at him. There was a tiredness in his expression that Leo couldn't quite place. It's okay, Leo, Daniel said softly. You didn't do anything wrong. He frowned and asked, then why are you acting weird? Daniel stayed quiet for a long moment, like he was picking his words with care. I don't really know what I mean to you anymore. The sentence hit like a slap. Leo's stomach twisted, and his mind raced. He was scrambling for something to say, but nothing came to mind. He hadn't expected this. He had been so focused on Michael, trying to figure out the truth, that he hadn't really thought about what it might do to Daniel, the guy who's always been there for every scraped knee and every bedtime story, every silly school project. The man who had never once made him feel like anything less than his son. Leo swallowed. That heavy guilt was creeping in, just like a slow tide. He really wanted answers. He just wanted to. He couldn't help but think, for the first time, that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong to go searching for them. Michael had spent. He thrived under pressure, making tough decisions throughout his life and building an impressive foundation. Empire thrives on taking calculated risks and being ruthlessly efficient, but no level of business can change that. His strategy had set him up for this moment, but honestly, he wasn't even sure what this really was. The whole world was all tidy and predictable, just the way it should be. Until a 10-year-old boy strolled in and changed everything. He really felt like he belonged there. He had tried to push it out of his mind, convincing himself that once the DNA test confirmed what he had already suspected, and he felt ready to handle it. So, then Isabel called, and everything changed again. We really need to talk. She didn't sound angry. It was more like she wasn't trying to pick a fight. She just sounded tired. Michael let out a slow breath, preparing himself. Go ahead, he said, and there was a pause. On the other end, there was a sigh. Daniel knew that wasn't a surprise he had. He kind of suspected it after their last chat, but hearing it confirmed still left a knot in his chest. Everything's such a mess, Isabel said, her voice tight as if she was trying to hold back more. So, she was saying that Leo just wanted to meet you. He didn't really think about how it would affect the rest of us, and now here we are. Daniel paused for a moment before saying, I really don't know how to fix this. Michael was looking out at the city skyline from his office window, gripping the phone a bit tighter. He could just walk away. He had every reason to feel that way. He hadn't asked for this, and he definitely hadn't planned for it. But there was something in Isabel's voice that really showed she hadn't seen this coming at all. He said, "I don't want to make things harder for you, but I also can't." She walked away from him, and the silence lingered for so long that he nearly believed she had hung up. Finally, she broke the quiet and said, "Meet." When he got to the hotel, you could really feel the tension in the air. It was almost unbearable. Isabel was standing by the window, arms crossed, looking like she hadn't slept. Daniel was sitting on the couch. His posture was stiff, and his gaze was distant. It was obvious he didn't want Michael there, but he just walked in without saying a word. Michael, on the other hand, didn't waste any time and took a seat right away. Leaning forward a bit, he said, "Let's just get this out of the way. I don't know what you expect. I've got nothing to prove here, and honestly, I'm not looking to turn this into a fight." Daniel just chuckled softly and shook his head. "It's easy for you to say that since you just learned about him a few days ago." Michael met his father's gaze evenly, saying, "I'm not trying." Daniel scoffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "So, what are you trying to do?" Michael admitted he doesn't know yet, but he's sure he won't pretend otherwise. Isabel finally turned away from the window and glanced between the two of them. "All that really matters is Leo's happiness," Daniel said with a sharp exhale, nodding in agreement. So, there was this moment when he leaned forward, just resting his forearms on his knees. "I really don't care about DNA. I raised him, and I love him. That's what matters. But if he wants to get to know you, and I won't stand in his way." It wasn't easy for him to find the right words, but Michael could do it. He saw that, and Michael nodded slowly, getting what that meant. He had spent his whole life building walls, keeping attachments at arm's length. It was quite a sacrifice for Daniel. On the other hand, he had done the exact opposite. He had given his heart fully and completely, only to. He discovered that the foundation of his family wasn't what he believed, but here he was, still putting Leo first. Michael respected that. So let's just ask him what he wants. He mentioned it wasn't really about who had the strongest claim or about winning or losing. It was more about giving Leo a choice, you know? And it was the first time Michael understood that whatever the boy decided would change all of their lives forever. Leo had never felt so torn in his life. He had wanted this, hadn't he? To meet. Michael wanted to check out for himself whether the man from the books and news articles matched up with the person he had in mind. But now, everything felt complicated. He hadn't thought about what it would do to Daniel and hadn't realized that searching for one part of his identity could really rock the life he was used to. It was like being a kid who had tugged on a loose thread just to see the entire sweat come undone in his hands. The tension in the hotel room was just unbearable. Isabel was quiet, her usual warmth a bit edged with something else. Exhaustion. Daniel wasn't avoiding him, but he definitely wasn't the same either. She had never looked at Leo with hesitation before. She had never made him feel like there was something unspoken between them. Made Leo's stomach twist like he had accidentally broken something he didn't even realize was fragile. He lay awake that night long after Isabel and Daniel had gone to bed. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling that heavy weight in his chest that just wouldn't lift. He really needed some fresh air. He needed some space to think, so he quietly slid out of bed, slipping on his. He slipped on his sneakers and grabbed his hoodie, feeling that restless urge to get moving. The streets were calling. Still busy. The neon glow of sharp signs flickers against the pavement as he walks by. He stuffed his hands into his pockets and walked, his thoughts circling aimlessly. Was it selfish to know Michael? Was it? To be fair to Daniel, he really didn't mean to hurt him, but maybe that doesn't change anything, you know? Maybe it just is what it is. Just realizing the truth changed everything for him. He was so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he didn't notice. One moment he was stepping off the curb, and the next, there was a blaring horn and the screech of tires. As his head snapped up against the asphalt, he caught sight of headlights rushing toward him. The impact hit him suddenly and violently. His body jolted as he was thrown sideways, pain exploding through his side while the pavement rushed up to meet him. There were shouts, someone yelling for help, the distant wail of a siren, and then everything just went quiet. When he opened his eyes again, everything was a blur, fading into black, and the sterile surroundings felt overwhelming. The white of a hospital ceiling blurred in and out of focus, while voices softly murmured in the background. Nearby, a blend of familiar and unfamiliar sounds made his whole body ache. His wrist was throbbing with a sharp, dull pain, and he groaned. Suddenly, he noticed movement around him. Leo, his mother's. He turned his head a bit, blinking as her face came into view. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her expression was tense with worry as she reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. He was standing there too, just behind her, arms crossed as if he was trying to hold himself together. Leo's breath caught for a moment as he noticed Michael, the man, standing a bit apart from them. His posture was stiff and unreadable, but he was there. Leo swallowed, his throat dry. The silence lingered a bit too long before he managed to put on a small, weary smile. Well, I guess I'm grounded for life, huh? There was a beat of silence then. There was this laughter, short and breathless, the kind that hits you after a huge wave of relief. Even Daniel joined in with a shaky laugh. Isabel let out a chuckle, rubbing a hand over her face and shaking her head as she did. She wiped at her eyes. You scared me half to death. Leo winced, shifting slightly. Yeah, I totally freaked myself out, and then the doctor came in a few minutes later to explain things. He had a mild concussion and a fractured wrist, but thankfully, nothing more serious. He'd be sore, but he'd bounce back. Isabel fired off a dozen questions at Daniel. Michael hovered nearby, still visibly shaken, and remained quiet as he listened to both of them. Taking it all in without saying a word, it wasn't until later when the room finally settled and Isabel and Daniel went out to chat with the doctor. And that's when Michael finally got a bit closer. Leo was watching him. Michael looked on, a bit unsure of what to expect for the first time. Less like the untouchable celebrity Leo had seen on magazine covers, and more like someone who wasn't quite sure what to say. Michael plopped down in the chair next to the bed. He didn't say anything at first, just letting the silence hang in the air between them. Leo was. So, you're the one who broke it. What now? Michael sighed, rubbing his hand along his jaw. That's your call, kid. Leo took a long look at him. He had invested so much time. I'm just picturing what this guy was like, trying to build a mental image of him. Some of my guesses were spot on, but a lot of it was off. He hadn't expected someone so cold and distant, a businessman through and through, but then Michael showed up and surprised him. Hearing that meant something. Leo smirked slightly, shifting in the bed. I think I want to stick around with you for a bit. Michael blinked, clearly. Leo was caught off guard. Of all the things he had expected, that definitely wasn't one of them. He watched him, waiting for a. Michael nodded, even though there was a moment of hesitation about the rejection. All right, just like that. Leo exhaled a breath he didn't even know he was holding. It was pretty cool. Simple, but just enough. Leo ended up staying in the hospital for a little while longer. He took a few days to make sure he was healing right, and during that time, his mom and Daniel were trying to figure out how to move forward. They would visit him every morning and evening, bringing along coloring books, snacks, and anything else they thought he might like. Michael also stopped by, though not as often, and he always had that uncertain vibe about him. It might brighten his mood. There was a look that hinted at a guy stepping into unknown territory, and the tension between Isabel and Daniel was still very much there. Even though it was overnight, they were able to set aside their own fears and frustrations to concentrate on Leo's recovery that day. The doctor mentioned that Leo was good to go for discharge, and Isabel softly suggested that it might be better for him to stay a bit longer. She decided to stay in the city a bit longer and spend time with Michael. It wasn't a decision she made lightly. There was this ache in her face whenever she glanced at her son, a blend of love and hesitation, like she was caught in a tug-of-war. It was a bit of a tug-of-war, trying to balance keeping him close while also giving him the space to discover what truly mattered to him. Daniel, on his end, seemed to have accepted it all. Still looked at Leo with the same affection as always, but now there was a hint of caution in his eyes whenever the topic came up. When paternity came up, he took Leo aside before they left the hospital, pulling. As he pulled Daniel into a firm hug, Leo could sense his heart racing more than usual. It hit him how unusual it was to see the guy so out of sorts. Daniel spoke softly. He told Leo that he loved him and that while some things might feel different at the moment, nothing could change their bond. He nodded, wishing he could find the right words to express just how grateful he was for everything Daniel had done for him. Isabel had spent her whole life hanging back just a bit, working hard to hold it together. Even though it was clear she was struggling with her doubts about leaving Leo behind, she still said it was what he needed. What could help him understand who he was and what he wanted from his new relationship with Michael? This isn't forever, she said, her voice a bit shaky. But maybe it's what you need. Leo hugged her. He pressed his face into her shoulder, and she smelled like home. He felt a wave of comfort and safety wash over him, and for a moment, he thought about breaking down and begging her to stay. But he didn't. He just swallowed hard. He held back his tears and managed to nod, forcing a small smile as he told her he understood. She kissed his forehead and reminded him to behave, while Daniel, looking a bit serious, took Leo's good hand for one last squeeze. "I love you no matter where you are," Daniel said softly. And Leo felt that squeeze. It resonated all the way to his chest. I could tell he whispered back, feeling the sting in his eyes. Soon, they were gone. And Leo found himself alone in the hospital room with Michael. The man seemed more tense than ever. It felt like the reality of having a 10-year-old boy around had just hit me. And there was no way to avoid that moment with Leo. Heading home with him for a bit, Michael cleared his throat, looking for. Leo saved him the hassle by giving a nervous grin. "Promise I won't burn your place down." Michael didn't exactly laugh, but I could see a corner of his mouth twitching. Text. I'm really glad they decided to head out. And Leo was squinting at that shiny black car that was ready to take them to Michael's home. He'd taken taxis, been on planes, and rode subways. But he'd never experienced anything quite as polished as this. A car with tinted windows pulled up, and the driver, dressed in a sharp suit, greeted Michael like he was some kind of royalty lounging in the back seat. Leo did his best to stay still as the city buzzed outside, but his mind just wouldn't settle. I'm feeling a mix of worry for Isabel and Daniel, along with excitement about what this new situation might bring, and a certain. He felt a bit uneasy about living with someone he hardly knew. Michael, on his end, would check his phone from time to time and type a message. A couple of quick messages, and then he put it aside. His face didn't show much. But Leo felt a bit on edge as they arrived at Michael's building. His jaw almost dropped at the sight of the towering glass structure. The structure towered over the street, looking like a modern fortress made of steel and tinted windows. Inside, the lobby was sleek and stylish, with marble floors and a sense of quiet elegance. The doorman greeted Michael with a polite nod before they hopped on the elevator. It moved so smoothly that it was a bit disorienting. Leo did his best not to stare when the doors swung open right into Michael's space. The penthouse was massive, filled with natural light pouring in from the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a stunning view of the city beneath. The furniture had a modern vibe, and the decor was minimalistic. It felt more like. Leo's steps echoed on the polished floor, making it feel more like a luxury hotel suite than a home. As he ventured inside, he craned his neck to take it all in. Michael hovered behind him, watching. Leo set his bag down, doing so with a sense of caution, almost like he was expecting some questions or complaints. She turned slowly, taking in the spacious living area, the sleek kitchen, and the corridor. "So, that took us to the bedrooms. It's a bit different," and he offered it, "but I'm not entirely sure about it. How can I say this differently?" Michael rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You'll get used to it." Leo nodded, but he wasn't really convinced. He had a restless night that first time being alone. In a guest room that was larger than the living room in his apartment back home, the bed felt a bit too soft, and the silence was palpable. It was a bit unsettling. With just the faint hum of the air conditioning in the background, he found himself staring at the ceiling, lost in thoughts about Isabel. Daniel was wondering if they were okay by morning. He had dozed off just enough to. Michael was already in the kitchen, dressed in one of his usual suits and sipping something green when he woke up feeling groggy. Leo took a guess that it was a health drink and made a face at it. Michael raised an eyebrow in response, saying, "It's good for you," he said, pointing at the fridge. "There's cereal, eggs, or whatever you want, Leo." They rummaged around, looking for something that seemed edible. There wasn't much conversation while they ate, just an awkward silence hanging in the air. It was more like a careful dance, with each of them figuring out what the other was okay with. After breakfast, Michael mentioned to him that I had a couple of meetings to go to, and I heard that Jonas, the assistant Leo has been talking about, would be there to keep an eye on things. Leo naturally wanted to tag along to the meetings, but Michael was a bit hesitant. But he eventually gave in, maybe because of guilt or curiosity, though he made it clear that Leo should keep quiet and not say anything. They really shook things up for about 5 minutes as soon as they walked in. Sleek conference room, and Leo couldn't help himself. He was wide-eyed, taking it all in. At the Polish table, the projection screens are set up, and the austere men and women with their laptops open are all just waiting for Michael to speak. The meeting kicked off, and Leo settled in on the side, swinging his legs and doing his best to stifle a yawn during the more boring presentations. So, we were talking about our quarterly projections. And then someone brought up this marketing campaign targeting young consumers. That's when Leo jumped in with There was a straightforward critique about how dull their approach seemed. And then everyone just paused for a moment. Michael shot him a look that could have scared off someone else, but Leo just shrugged. You want to catch people's? Hey, just a heads up, try not to stick with the same formula that everyone else is using in marketing. Executives shifted uncomfortably, glancing around for direction, but Michael just waved his hand. And they got back to the meeting. Jonas walked over to Leo with a smile and said that maybe next time, Leo should think about taking some notes before he speaks up. He laughed and said maybe next time he should just handle the whole presentation himself. The first few days were a bit chaotic, sometimes tense, and often packed with moments that had Michael questioning everything. He had signed up for Leo, who was always pushing, always asking, and always throwing in. He made some waves with his commentary, critiquing Michael's suits and calling them the dullest clothes ever. He tried to help Jonas get his schedules sorted out, but it ended up with Jonas running after him around the office while Leo watched. He joked about the company expanding into space tourism and somehow convinced Jonas to let him join the ride. Michael had a private jet for fun, but he definitely drew the line at letting him sit in the cockpit. Little by little, Michael found himself getting used to Leo's energy. The penthouse started to feel less like a fancy museum and more like a real home. So, the kids' sneakers began showing up by the door. And as soon as the fridge was filled with cereals and snacks that Leo enjoyed, things started to feel a bit more lively. So, they kind of fell into this routine where Michael would wake up early, get in a workout, and then grab a quick breakfast with Leo, who Michael mentioned that he would definitely ask if he could shadow him at the office sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes he would ask Leo to hang back and read or do something that was more suitable for his age. Every day brought a fresh challenge. A new nudge between a guy who had never been a dad and a kid who was figuring things out. He often thought about how to connect with someone he had always been curious about. Even with the ups and downs, there were nights when they would discover things together. Leo was lounging on the couch, scrolling through random websites and sharing interesting articles or trivia he found. Michael found himself in a surprisingly engaging conversation when he discovered that Leo had a passion for random facts, especially the stranger ones. He found it interesting how money seemed to influence everything, from technology to the media. Leo, on the other hand, got insights into the focus and sacrifice that went into building a billion-dollar empire from the ground up. He also playfully teased Michael about never going on a Rio vacation. Especially during a quiet moment with Leo, Michael noticed the boy slipping into a quiet mood, clearly lost in thoughts about home. He didn't push him to talk, sensing that the boy needed that space. I just needed some space to unwind for a night after a crazy day filled with back-to-back meetings. Michael was pacing back and forth in the penthouse living room, clearly stressed about a minor PR crisis, while Leo just leaned against the wall, observing him. Michael let out a small, thoughtful laugh as he paused to glance over at Leo. With a smirk, he said, "You're not as scary as people think." Michael crossed his arms. His posture still showed a hint of tension. "Don't tell anyone," he said with a faint smile. "The curve of his mouth is going to ruin my image." Leo laughed softly, stepping forward. Just between us, the two of them stood there, sharing a quick moment of understanding. The next day came with its usual challenges, but somehow every evening seemed to bring them a bit closer to a strange sort of. Even though things were familiar, it wasn't perfect. Leo still missed his mother and was still worried about her. Daniel would sometimes check in to see if they were all right, and Michael did his best to offer some reassurance. He promised that they could call anytime or even fly out to visit if needed. But for now, Leo was here, checking out a different side of life. One that had shiny floors and the steady buzz of business calls, but it also gave him the opportunity to see Michael not just as someone on a book cover, but as a real person who was still figuring things out. How to invite another person into their carefully protected world. Summer flew by. in a whirlwind of new experiences for both Michael and Leo. As the weeks slipped by, Ether seemed totally ready for the day Leo was set to head back to Spain. They both had initially looked at the whole arrangement as a short-term solution gives a father and son the opportunity to bond without the usual school pressures. Routines back home, yet what began as a bit of an experiment turned into a time of. Michael found himself forming a genuine bond that he hadn't expected. He had intended to approach it like any other organized project, but it turned out to be something more special, driven with a clear goal in mind. But taking a moment to watch Leo get comfortable in his penthouse, noticing the excitement on the boy's face, he brought warmth to the quiet rooms and changed his perspective in ways he never saw coming. Leo took to it, checking out every little corner and shifting around some furniture to create more room for those random hobbies he picked up, leaving scattered items around the living area that gave the place a lived-in feel despite his efforts. At first, Michael felt a bit weary, but he started to become more accepting of the clutter, drawn in by a sense of normalcy. In the mornings, they'd have these quick chats over breakfast, with Michael sticking to his strict schedule. With Leo's curiosity about the day's agenda, Jonas figured it was a good idea to keep an extra seat in every meeting room, just in case. Leo joined in, eager to ask the kind of bold questions that most adults wouldn't even think to bring up. At first, Michael was concerned that having a kid around during those high-stakes discussions would be a bit disruptive. But honestly, it turned out to be quite the opposite. It actually forced. Sometimes Leo would complain about needing to see his work environment through fresh eyes. They talked about how boring some charts or projections looked, which got Michael and his team thinking about how he shared his thoughts and understood that making concepts easier for Leo was important. They were also making things clearer overall. It was an unexpected benefit, though he rarely said it out loud. Evenings were the best part of Leo's street. When Michael got home, they would often chat. We talked about all sorts of things that weren't related to business, like taking a stroll to a nearby park so Leo could kick around a soccer ball. One night, Leo just started rambling about some random facts he had discovered online. Michael was really excited about futuristic technology and how he believed virtual reality could change the game for education. He just couldn't contain his thoughts on it. Remember the last time he had a chat that wasn't all about profit margins or deadlines, and the more. As they talked, Leo started to see how much he had been missing out on those simple conversations that were just about curiosity. She also reminded him that not everything had to be taken so seriously. More than once, the boy acted a bit silly. Jokes were flying around while Michael was going through some important documents, and they managed to get a reluctant smile out of him that was hard to miss. Before he knew it, Michael was looking forward to both of them by surprise. To these little interruptions, catching a glimpse of a life that wasn't just about contracts and press releases, though. Isabel and Daniel were having a great time together. But there was this quiet understanding of the end date hanging over them. I've been keeping in touch with Leo, updating him about life in Spain, checking in on his health, and sharing some news. Just some little bits of everyday news that made him head home during those quiet moments. Michael, despite all his wealth and influence, he couldn't replace the love and familiarity that Leo had grown up with, and he didn't even try. Instead, he offered his support when the kid had that distant look. A reminder that a plane ticket across the ocean was always an option. Leo felt grateful that, even without saying it outright, he could tell that Michael got how conflicted he was about feeling happy. Daniel was trying to adjust to this new environment, but he couldn't shake off the comfort of his old one. He was still grappling with everything that had happened. He managed to keep the conversations casual and light, never once letting the lingering hurt seem to overshadow his affection for Leo. Isabel, on the other hand, sometimes grew quiet when she talked to him. Leo seemed to be looking for the right words to ask if the boy was really okay. He always told her he was doing fine, but what he didn't mention was how he sometimes wished they were all together. They could really share this odd transitional time without too much fuss. As the last days of summer roll in, Leo's flight was all set and ready to go. The date on Michael's calendar felt like it was getting bigger with every sunrise, and neither of them really said anything about how they were feeling. Michael steered clear of the topic, diving into his work even more than usual, while Leo stayed occupied checking out different areas of the city he hadn't seen before, always returning with a fresh story to share. Last night, just before they were set to leave, they decided to order takeout. They plopped down on the couch and spent some time flipping through channels in silence. The hum of the city below the penthouse windows was strangely comforting, and Leo looked around, soaking in every detail. He seemed to want to remember it just right. At one point, he paused, set down the remote, and said it was funny. It's interesting to think about how quickly people can become close when they have the right time and space. Michael nodded, not quite trusting himself to say more. It was detailed, but you could tell they both got the importance of what he was saying. On the morning of the flight, Michael woke up early and noticed that Leo was already dressed, with his small suitcase packed and waiting by the door. The boy looked restless, fidgeting with the handle of the bag. Michael realized he had been dreading this moment. He didn't want to go back to being the closed-off person he used to be before Leo came along, but he also realized he couldn't keep the boy at a distance from his real home. The car ride to the airport was pretty quiet. Leo just stared out the window. We were just sitting by the window, watching the city go by, almost like we were trying to remember every little detail. While Michael was busy replying to a few messages on his phone, Jonas drove them, picking up on the mood and holding back, all while his phone seemed to demand more attention than usual. Once they got to the terminal, Michael stopped his usual chatter and helped Leo with check-in before leading him to the security line. People were bustling around with their suitcases and boarding passes, creating a whirlwind of motion. But for just a moment, everything seemed to pause. Everything seemed to slow down as Michael ruffled Leo's hair, a gesture he had never really tried before, but one that felt right. That felt surprisingly right as the boy shifted his weight. He glanced down at the scuffed sneakers that had become his trademark over the summer, then looked up. "You sure about this?" This time, Michael's voice was softer than usual, and a part of him almost wished Leo would say he changed his mind just to avoid watching the kid vanish into the crowd, but he just nodded. He swallowed once before saying that Spain was home and that he'd visit. Michael nodded in return, trying to keep his composure. As he kept his cool, the overhead speakers droned on with announcements, calling passengers to various gates and reminding everyone they were getting their IDs ready, but at that moment, it felt like it was just the two of them, balancing between two worlds. Leo. He took a step back, hoisting his carry-on bag over his shoulder. "That's a promise," he said. The kid paused for a moment, then turned to head toward the gate, blending in with the crowd moving forward. He made it. He took a few steps before glancing back one last time, a little grin tugging at his mouth. "See you soon, old man," he said, the words hanging in the air, echoed in the terminal light, but it was meaningful, a bridge between the past and present. Michael stood still, letting the sights and sounds of the airport surrounded him as he watched Leo disappear from sight. He stayed there a bit longer than he intended. He meant for the hum of voices and the shuffle of footsteps to blend into a blur. Eventually, he exhaled, realizing, in a sudden moment of clarity, he realized something he didn't often feel, a deep blend of pride and longing. Leo was gone, but the bond they had built kept them connected, even with the distance that was about to stretch between continents. On the ride back from the airport, Jonas looked in the rearview mirror a couple of times, almost like he was expecting Michael to show up. Michael just sat there, quiet, flipping his phone over in his hands without really paying attention to it. He thought about how much his life had changed in such a short time. Not too long ago, he was someone who measured success came from profit margins and market share. And he was someone who thrived on negotiations and decisive strategies. Someone who understood the importance of allowing a child to explore their own way of doing things. And who enjoyed a good laugh at silly jokes. In the middle of the night, someone realized they cared more about one person's well-being than anything else. Corporate victory. These thoughts flowed through his mind like a gentle stream, not loud or dramatic, just there, steady and constant. When he got back to the penthouse, he walked in and noticed it felt a bit off. The absence of Leo felt so noticeable. It was like the constant chatter and scuffling feet had vanished. It was all gone. There were just a few signs left behind, like a couple of drawings stuck on the fridge and a half-finished puzzle sitting there. Michael set his keys down on the coffee table and let his gaze linger on the puzzle for a moment. At that moment, he realized he could just leave it there completely, or he could wrap it up himself. That thought felt like a little spark. He took off his suit jacket and placed it carefully on leaned against the back of a chair and sank onto the couch, letting the quiet wrap around him. He didn't feel lonely, not really. It was more like he had entered a new phase of his life, a space he had never experienced before. Occupied before one where he wasn't just the co-boss or the guy calling the shots, but someone who actually had a place in a child's life. And that child had a special place in his thoughts about Leo. He had said at the gate, "See you soon." It felt like a promise that gave him a sense of they had a clear plan for what was coming next. No matter how they managed it, whether it was through calls or visits, maybe even extended stays, he realized that Leo would always be a part of him. Nothing would be the same now. And somehow he felt it. For the first time, he was completely at peace with that. He didn't mind not having a perfectly orchestrated plan. He just let it be. He just felt that satisfaction that came from grasping a deeper truth. Being a father wasn't just about. It wasn't just about blood ties or obligations. It was really about being there for someone else and putting their needs first. Every now and then, he thought about how to express his feelings, even when it seemed easier to keep them tucked away. He lingered on the. After lounging on the couch for a bit, I finally got up and strolled over to the glass wall that offered a view of the city as the sun was setting. Paint the skyline with colors he usually overlooked while checking stock updates, but this time he took a moment to. He'll get back to the usual board meetings and strategic plans eventually. But for now, tonight he allowed himself this moment. The phone in his pocket buzzed with a reminder about a pending conference call, but he just ignored it. He took a quick look at it before hitting the button to silence the vibration. At that moment, he felt pretty content just standing there with one hand in his pocket. He thought about that scrappy kid who turned everything upside down in just one summer. He quietly recognized it. So, while Leo was making his way back to Spain, they'd just sort out the rest. They had all the time in the world to work on it. He turned away from the view, walked past the puzzle on the table, and grabbed the first piece he noticed. He lined it up to see if it fit. And a faint smile tugged at him as it clicked into place. A gentle reminder that your journey starts with small steps, and sometimes, letting the unexpected into your life is the best way to go. Find out who you truly are. If you like this story, don't hesitate to share your thoughts. Don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel out. And if you're looking for more heartwarming and emotional stories, just let me know. Hey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss any uploads. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to know what you think about this one. Thanks for tuning in, and I can't wait to catch you in the next story.